Okay guys, so this is the beginning of Module 4. The first reading you had was by Politz and Karahanna, Shackled to the Status Quo. So I read this article years ago and it really just changed my life. I mean, I couldn't believe that there was so much written about status quo bias and how impactful it is to the diffusion of an innovation, and that there was actual like academic reading behind this. So you guys may not remember, but I spent 30 years of my career in technology sales, and I always worked for, I would call them leading edge companies. At the time, I started out with IBM, which was definitely leading edge when I started. I moved on to Sun Microsystems. And then I spent some time with R.L. Polk and a couple of other companies, and then I went to Salesforce. So I was with these companies when they had been in existence for, over 10 years or so. So by that time, technology really isn't bleeding edge anymore. It's really more, leading edge, so it shouldn't be as risky. But the amount of user resistance I encountered was remarkable. And as a salesperson, you don't do a lot of research. You don't go out and look at academic readings, try to figure out why this stuff's going on. You just know that this is just part of your job and you're just going to have to deal with it. But when I had a chance to actually do some reading, it was incredible that this was out there and that companies really weren't approaching this type of bias and these types of this type of diffusion reluctance in any sort of like real way. It just kind of happened, and if the diffusion didn't get in, that was fine. Maybe they made a good decision, maybe not. But generally speaking, this was just a lot of personal conflicts that people had with the technology. So when I started reading about this, I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So first we'll go into a couple of definitions here. So inertia is remaining at rest or in uniform motion in the same straight line unless acted upon by some external force. This is part of this is subconscious incumbent systems habit. So sometimes inertia is actually viewed as a positive, right? We've got a lot of inertia behind us, and but in general, you're just moving straight. So there's no potential for any variation to what's happening. There's no potential for change in any way. Inertia is forward motion, but in a straight line. So depending on how you look at it, from a technology perspective, inertia is not necessarily looked at as positive. It is something that's been there for a long time that has no potential for change. Things that affect, the other thing that affects status quo bias, so inertia is one of them, and then psychological commitment. So behind psychological commitment are things like incorrectly factoring in sunk cost. So a sunk cost is something that has already been spent, and from an accounting perspective, we no longer take that into consideration when we're talking about future endeavors. So we've spent the money, we made the decision, it's sitting over here, and that's it. But in IT, they often take that into consideration as an investment. So it's not considered a sunk cost. We've already invested in this, and so therefore we can't do something else. So that's why it's referred to as incorrectly factoring in sunk costs. Striving for cognitive consistency in decision making, we want to do the same thing. So we've got a lot of fancy words for saying, we want to do the same thing. The next one, maintaining one's social position. This we talk about quite a bit in the next section, because it has to do with identity threat. IT is an identity threat. So we won't go into it too much there, but it just has to do with a person's responsibility. So for instance, in an IT organization, if I'm responsible for a particular application and you're going to replace it with something else, that may impact my social position at the company. And then avoid regret from a bad decision. So you know, obviously there's a lot of responsibility associated with, you know, bringing in new IT systems, and if somebody does a bad job, then, you know, they're concerned about how that's going to impact them. And maintaining control. So this is a big one, because, you know, at the end of the day, of course, the company is still under control. It is just this aspect of the company that is different. And so someone else may have control. So this is about an individual maintaining control. So inertia is the strong persistence of existing form and function. If the form is efficient, then inertia is costless and beneficial. If not, inertia is a problem. So obviously this has to do with how we defined inertia. So if it is good for the company, it's beneficial. If it's efficient, or the efficient way to do things. But if it's not, if there's another alternative that's more efficient, then, you know, we're not doing justice to the company. Individual level inertia, attachment to and persistence of existing patterns of behavior, even if there are better alternatives or incentives to change. So a rigid continuance of the status quo. So when you're talking about individual level inertia, the important part here is even if there's a better alternative or incentives to change. So this is an individual who is saying, I don't care what the alternative is. I don't care if it's better or not. I don't care if somebody wants me to do it. I'm going to continue doing what I was doing before, and I'm gonna make it hard for this new innovation to diffuse. Inertia in the IS context, user attachment to and persistence in using an incumbent system, even if there are better alternatives or incentives to change. So this has to do with when you're introducing a new system into the organization, and there's an old system, and you're saying to people, we'd like you to start using the new system. And people start to say, well, you know what, I'll use it tomorrow, but today I've got to get my job done, and so I'm going to do it over here. And, you know, this goes on, and there is a great resistance to learning and using the new system. This is obviously an issue when you're dealing with rolling out a system. You know, if you allow two systems to coexist, you're going to introduce this problem that people can choose basically which system they use. Cognitive-based inertia consciously continues to use a system even though they are aware that it might not be the most efficient way to do things. So again, we understand that there's potentially another, maybe better or more efficient way of doing things, and we continue forward with the old way because we're more comfortable. This preserves our, you know, our comfort level, our sense of control. And effective-based inertia continue to use because they may have it may be stressful for them to change. They're comfortable, and they've developed an emotional attachment to the current way of doing things. So we know that when we do things over and over again, and there's a comfort level in our routines, and this is what this is all about. It is stressful to change, to do things in a different way. It creates anxiety. They're comfortable and they want to continue down this path. Contributors to inertia, distorted perception and dulled motivation due to insufficiently felt need to change. So obviously they just aren't motivated to change. Failed creative response, inadequate strategic vision, low personal innovativeness. So this is a big one. This has to do with whether you're comfortable with new technology or not. So are you the first one in line, you know, for the new iPhone? Are you an early adopter, or are you a laggard? Low personal innovativeness is going to be more on the laggard, or you know, the late majority in adoption. Education and training, so obviously it helps a great deal if people know what they're doing and how to use the system. So if you just kind of toss it in there and expect people to figure it out, that's going to be a problem. Precedents, traditions, rituals, and formalized procedures. So the more people, how do we say this? So when you introduce new technology, we've talked about the fact that there are downstream effects to it. There are different procedures and processes that have to change. And if, for example, you introduce a new system, but the guy downstream still wants his report from, you know, the old system, he hasn't changed his process, it's going to be impossible for this person to change theirs. Otherwise, they're going to be doing twice the work, which is extremely inefficient. So when we introduce new technology, we have to understand what the upstream and downstream effects of this are and make sure that those processes change as well. So here's a quick break. We're going to stop here and we'll pick up with the next video.